Well, first of all, thank you to the San Francisco Public Library for inviting me to talk about my book today, and thanks to Lori for all the technical assistance along the way, and including some last-minute troubleshooting, which I think we have under control. She's going to run the slides, and I'm going to have to say next slide in between. So next slide. All right. Again, thank you to the audience for joining me here today to talk about my book, which is called False: How Mistrust, Disinformation, and Motivated Reasoning Make Us Believe Things That Aren't True. My goal today is to give you a kind of overview of the book, while, of course, trying to get you interested enough to give it a read. Next slide. I think we got out of order, but thanks for the introduction. As was stated, I am a psychiatrist. My clinical work through the years is really focused on the treatment of individuals with psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. And so for 30 some years now, I've worked on a daily basis with patients who have delusions. Delusions are false beliefs held with unassailable conviction, like believing that you're the second coming of Christ or that the FBI has implanted a tracking device in your brain. Now, when we encounter delusions in psychiatry, we often attribute them to psychopathology. So we say that people believe delusions because they're psychotic or because they have schizophrenia. Even in depression, we talk about things like cognitive distortions, like telling ourselves that we're unattractive or that we'll never amount to anything. And we say, well, people have those sorts of cognitive distortions because they're depressed. Next slide. But I think, as is increasingly obvious these days, demonstrably false and imminently consequential beliefs that are held with unwarranted conviction are in no way limited to people with mental illness. And so, as was mentioned in my academic work, I'm just as interested in phenomenon that lie in the gray area between psychopathology and normality. And in today's world, we could argue that there's no more timely and relevant example of this than false beliefs, than believing things that aren't true. Now, surprisingly, the question of why we all believe things that aren't true and why we often cling to them very tenaciously has been relatively neglected in psychiatry as well as psychology. And so I wrote False to offer an explanation and to review the literature and the research that's been done on this subject through the years to explain why it is that normal people like you and me believe things that aren't true and how that can create significant problems in our lives, in our relationships, in our interactions with other people, as well as in national and global politics today. Next slide. Now, one thing I do try to make clear in the book is that we all believe things that aren't true, whether that's self-deception aimed at avoiding distress, having false memories, having contradictory philosophical or religious beliefs about what happens when we die, or just plain getting the facts wrong from time to time. So only the most arrogant among us would ever claim that we're never wrong and we're always right about everything. We should also acknowledge that there are many areas of inquiry where the facts are elusive or unknown and are legitimately debatable. And so the certain kinds of belief are not really the focus of my book and not what I'm talking about today. So I won't be talking, for example, about why we believe in God or what God we believe in. I won't be talking about things like belief in angels or ghosts or the paranormal. I won't be talking about, beliefs about whether or not we live in a computer simulation. My interest and the reason I wrote this book is to talk about beliefs in so-called alternative facts. That is, false beliefs that people have, despite the truth being known with reasonable certitude. And my focus is also on beliefs that I think that matter, what I say are eminently consequential because of their negative effects. And so here's a couple examples. Next slide. Uh, so, um, Beliefs about vaccines, the belief that vaccines cause autism, or beliefs that vaccines are more dangerous than the diseases they're designed to prevent. Uh, False beliefs like that climate change is merely a hoax, that the Holocaust never happened, that the 2020 election was rigged or stolen, that immigrants were eating pets, eating cats and dogs in Ohio, or that germs don't cause disease. Next slide. Now, with that said, before I say anything about false beliefs, let's talk a little bit about beliefs just more generally and go through what I would call a little belief 101. Next slide. So, to begin with, let me offer an answer to the question, what is a belief? Next slide. Um, next slide again. The etymology of the word belief can be traced back to the Germanic word lub, which means to like or to hold dear. Suffice it to say, however, that there are many different definitions of belief depending on who you ask or what academic discipline you ask. So, a philosopher might say that a belief is a proposition that something is true, or a psychologist might call it a state of mind in which confidence is placed in some person or thing. I like to define belief as a cognitive representation of the past, present, or future reality that encompasses our inner experiences, the world around us, and the world beyond. Next slide. So, next, let's talk about why we believe, meaning what kinds of reasons or justifications do we give for why we hold beliefs and why we think that things are true. Next slide. I would argue that there's four common reasons that we justify our beliefs. Next slide. The first one would be intuition. This is what Stephen Colbert has called truthiness, the idea that it's kind of like an instinct. It depends on whether or not we feel something is true or not. Next slide. The second justification is faith. I argue that faith refers to choosing to believe when the evidence is lacking or uncertain. Next slide. Another reason is our own personal experience. This is the idea that seeing is believing. Sometimes flat earthers will say, well, I think the earth is flat because when I look out in a horizon, it looks flat. It doesn't look round. Even when I'm in an airplane, it looks flat, right? So that's the idea that subjective experience is the basis of a belief. And next slide, finally, because there are so many things that we don't really know about or we're not experts in, we often believe things because we have to trust in the testimony of other people. That could mean believing in something in the Bible, or it could mean believing something that scientists tell us. And so, while some of these reasons for believing can be reasonable and sound, I would argue that they can also get us into trouble and they can lead to false belief. Next slide. And so this is why we came up with this thing called the scientific method. You can go ahead and advance the slides until it says research. Keep going. There you go. Thank you. So the scientific method is is a perspective that says, well, we ought to believe things based on objective and reproducible evidence. And it's this process of doing research, looking again and again for reproducible evidence that gets us closer to the truth. Now, I would argue that one of the advantages of this perspective is that it is self-correcting. It requires that factual claims are supported by evidence, but that they're also subject to revision based on new evidence. Sometimes that can be frustrating because we hear, one year that drinking two drinks of alcohol per day is good for you, and now recent research is saying, well, actually, that's not true. Almost no alcohol is good for you. So, on the one hand, science tends to shift. Rather, the beliefs that are formed through the scientific method tend to shift because the evidence is always shifting. Now, the scientific method is, of course, something that we learn. It's not how we intuitively think. It's not even how we typically think. We don't think by starting out with a hypothesis and performing controlled experiments and gathering evidence. That's not how we intuitively think. Next slide. Now, when we talk about the scientific perspective of belief based on strength of evidence, and I like to say that when we do talk about our beliefs, we should talk about them or express them as probability judgments. We should recognize that belief is a continuum. And although we often talk about whether or not we believe something in a yes or no kind of way, we don't get a good sense of an individual's belief if we think about it in an all or nothing way. Instead, we can better understand belief as a matter of degree. Next slide. And so we can conceptualize degree of belief quantitatively along what psychologists call different cognitive dimensions. So this would include conviction, meaning how strongly we believe something, preoccupation, how much we think about a belief, as well as the emotionality, the affective valence that's connected to the belief. So if we think about it in this continuum, there are some beliefs that we have. There are other beliefs that we disagree with. There's some beliefs we might endorse but don't actually hold very strongly. There are some beliefs that we hold very strongly, but we don't spend a lot of time thinking about. And there are some beliefs that we do hold strongly, spend a lot of time thinking about, and care about very deeply so that they influence our behavior. So there's really quite a bit of variation when people say, I believe or I don't believe, what that really means. Next slide. Now, when we think about belief conviction, how strongly we believe in something, we should understand that contrary to the scientific perspective, our own confidence in our abilities and our convictions is often not proportional to how much we actually know, that is, our state of knowledge or the amount of evidence that we have access to. So, in my book, I talk about the paradox of faith. The paradox of faith is that we often believe most passionately about things that aren't supported by good evidence. The writer Robert Pirsig said, no one's jumping up and down enthusiastically saying, the sun's going to rise tomorrow. Like, we all know the sun's going to rise tomorrow. It's the things that are somewhat in question that require that faith, that require the active saying, I'm going to believe this because there's an element of uncertainty. Likewise, many people have heard of this thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect. That's something I talk about in the book. In a nutshell, what the Dunning-Kruger effect says um, is that when we have very low amounts of knowledge on a particular subject, we tend to be more confident about that subject. So that the gap between our confidence about our state of knowledge and our actual knowledge is greatest when we have low levels of knowledge. And so this is often misinterpreted to mean that like there's some class of people that have low knowledge and they're very confident about their beliefs. What's important to realize about Dunning-Kruger is that we all lack knowledge about some subjects. And so you might have a Nobel Prize winner in physics who knows nothing about auto mechanics, right? So it's not as if there's these experts and non-experts. We all have islands of expertise and relative ignorance. And so what the Dunning-Kruger effect shows is that we tend to be disproportionately confident about our knowledge in the areas where we're lacking. And in the internet era, there's also something that has been called the Google delusion, whereby we are more confident about our knowledge due to access to the internet. And so it's almost as if we're confusing information that we know or we think that we can find when we do a search with information that's actually in our brains, what we would consider to be knowledge. And so I sometimes refer to our relationship with the internet or our smartphones as our peripheral brains. And I think these days people also are now tending to interact with AI chatbots in much the same way, thinking, well, I'm very knowledgeable because I have access to, ChatGPT or something like that. Next slide. And finally, before I get into false beliefs, let's talk about a few different types of belief that are relevant to belief conviction. Next slide. So while most of what I focus on in the book and what I'll be talking about today are factual beliefs, that is, beliefs about what's true or not true, next slide, there are also values. Values I define as beliefs about what's important or not. Next slide. There's also morals. Morals are beliefs about what's right or wrong or good or bad. And finally, next slide, there are ideologies, which I define as thematically related factual beliefs, values, and morals. And realizing that there's these sort of different layers of belief, I think becomes extremely important when we try to understand things like political polarization, which is something I cover in my book, but I won't be talking too much about today. All right, next slide. Okay, so with that stage set, I'll now move into this question, which is fundamentally the question of my book. Why is it that we believe things that aren't true? And why is it that we often believe so strongly in those sorts of things? Next slide. To begin with, one thing that I make clear in the book, or hopefully make clear in the book, is that most of us don't believe things that aren't true because we're delusional. Despite what's often claimed, it's also not true that our false beliefs, or those of our ideological opponents for that matter, are due to being mentally ill. We're not suffering from mass delusion or mass psychosis. And as a psychiatrist, I can assure you that's not really what's going on here. Next slide. I'll also hope to convince you that for the most part, false beliefs, the kinds of false beliefs I'm talking about today, aren't a matter of stupidity or anti-intellectualism or even lack of critical thinking, even though that term is often used. While those kinds of explanations are very common, we hear them all the time these days, they're, I think, just too easy and too simplistic, and they misplace blame onto individuals at the expense of the bigger picture and having access to potential solutions. Next slide. Now, it is true that there are a multitude of cognitive processes that can help explain our vulnerability to false belief. And so in my book, I take the reader through various psychological phenomenon like cognitive biases, heuristics, logical fallacies, as well as specific examples like confirmation bias, cognitive dissonance, the illusory truth effect, even something called bullshit receptivity. All of these, I think, can help us understand why false belief can be so pervasive and tenacious. I think they can also particularly help to understand individual instances of false belief. But one thing I want to emphasize, and I think I emphasize throughout the book, is that these, I call them cognitive quirks, are really 100% normal in the sense that they are vulnerabilities that we all have, albeit to various degrees. And they aren't just the psychological foibles of our ideological opposites, no matter how often we like to frame them that way. Next slide. Next slide. And so, actually, two more next slides. And so, I argue for a simpler, more universal, less pathologizing, and less pejorative, what I call a more humanizing framework to understand false belief. These days, I refer to this as the 3M model, based on these three components. It's sort of like a three-headed monster. So the three components, or the three heads of the monster, are mistrust, misinformation, and motivated reasoning. And I don't refer to the 3M model by name in my book, but the subtitle of my book highlights mistrust, disinformation, and motivated reasoning. And those themes certainly figure heavily throughout the pages of the book. Next slide. So, to give you a brief overview of this, let's start with the first M, which is mistrust. And so, when I'm talking about mistrust, I'm talking about something called epistemic mistrust, which means mistrust of information, and more specifically, mistrust of mainstream sources of information, information coming from institutions of authority or scientific expertise. Next slide. And I think it's easy to appreciate that we're living in an era of significant mistrust. According to polling data in the US, this mistrust is broad and pervasive. So if, for example, we look back to the 1970s at polls that ask things just like how many people say that most people can be trusted? Well, compared to the 1970s, that has come down, not a huge amount, but it's been a good 12-point shift. Um, so it's now just under half to a third of people who now, or a shift from just under half to a third of people who now say that they, generally speaking, trust other people. Next slide. Likewise, coincidentally, over that time frame, there has been a much steeper decline in trust in the media. That is, in this poll, they're specifically asking about newspapers, TV, and the radio. So if you look at this Gallup poll, given over the past 5 decades, trust in media has decreased significantly, so that whereas back in the 1970s, some 70% of US adults had a great deal or a fair amount of trust in the media, now only about 30% have that kind of trust, while the rest say they either have not very much trust or no trust at all in the media. Next slide. Likewise, if we look at this Pew poll, trust in government has taken a nosedive, so that it's really now at historic lows over the past decade. Now, only about 20% of US adults trust the government to do what is right just about always or most of the time, compared to back in the, again, 60s and 70s. We're looking at as many as like 70 to 80% of poll respondents. Next slide. And this is just data that came out earlier this year from Gallup. Trust specifically in the executive branches of government, legislative branches, judicial branches are at 50-year lows. So for many of us, that's like the lowest point in our entire lives. Next slide. According to a survey called the General Social Survey, trust in science and scientists has actually held steadier through the years. Next slide. However, there has in fact been a significant decline in trust in scientists over just the past several years. And so while most people still trust scientists at least a fair amount, the proportion of poll respondents that say they have a great deal of confidence in scientists has fallen from about 40% to just now about a quarter of US adults since the start of the pandemic. Meanwhile, next slide, another quarter says that they have not too much or no confidence at all that scientists act in the best interests of the public, doubling from only about 12 to 15% at the start of the pandemic. And almost half of poll respondents say that scientists should stay out of policy debates. Next slide. Similar poll data from 2019 found that just under half of respondents believe that scientists are just as biased as anyone else. Next slide. And also, 35% believe that the scientific method can be used to produce any conclusion the researcher wants. Next slide. And so, due to this growing epistemic mistrust, some people have declared the death of expertise. Now, to be clear, I'm not claiming that we should all just blindly follow what we're told or authority figures. And there's no doubt that sometimes mistrust is earned due to trust violations in the form of scandals or conflicts of interest or corruption. But what I am claiming is that real expertise ought to count for something, and that when we reject expertise, it often amounts to blanket denialism rather than evidence based skepticism. And that, as this well known cartoon illustrates, can sometimes be harmful or even deadly. Next slide. So, according to my 3M model, when we're mistrustful of epistemic authority, whether it's other people, the government, the media, scientists, what have you, we then become vulnerable to misinformation as we go looking for answers. Next slide. Now, of course, misinformation, which I would define simply as false information, is nothing new. It's probably been around since human communication first began. Likewise, deliberate disinformation, right? And we usually define disinformation based on misinformation that's deliberately created or spread within knowledge that the information is false. That's certainly not a new phenomenon either. And for many, many years, it has been present as a for-profit industry. Next slide. The tricky thing, though, is that 30 years ago, it was easier to recognize disinformation because it was largely confined to the grocery store checkout line. Next slide. Today, however, it's much harder to tell the difference between information that's reliable and unbiased and information that's not. Next slide. Meanwhile, influencers peddle misinformation that have become influencers that peddle misinformation have become celebrity millionaires. Now, researchers at RAND have found that throughout history, truth decay, which includes mistrust of informational sources, the blurring of opinion and fact, and disagreement about what's true, has often followed the proliferation of misinformation that's been ushered in by new forms of media, whether it was newspapers or radio or TV, or of course now the internet. Next slide. And so if we look over the past 50 years, coincident with the expansion of cable TV and the internet boom, our media landscape has transformed so that we now have myriad sources of information accessible at the click of a button, with unreliable sources of information situated right alongside reliable ones, so that it's often difficult and sometimes even impossible to tell the difference. Next slide. And so if we, next slide. And so if we go back to the examples of false beliefs that I highlighted at the start of this talk, it's pretty easy to realize and acknowledge that these beliefs are beliefs based on information that's out there in the world. They're claims that have been authored, published, televised, recorded, you name it, for the public record. Next slide. And so it's easy to find beliefs or claims rather that vaccines cause autism. Next slide. Or that climate change is a hoax. Next slide. Hoax. And it's all too easy to find even more outrageous claims, like that immigrants were eating pets in Ohio. Next slide. Or even that the earth is flat. Next slide. That the Holocaust never happened. Next slide. That chemtrails are a reality. Next slide. that lizard people have infiltrated the government, that UFOs are regularly zooming around the planet and occasionally abducting people, and so on and so on. No matter how outlandish a topic these days, we can almost always find someone claiming evidence that it is true. Next slide. Now, you've probably heard that information scientists have found that within the click-based economy of the internet, misinformation and false news or fake news travels farther and faster than reliable news. Next slide. And sadly, the fact is that false information is much better at capturing our attention than the truth. Next slide. And this is because it's titillating, and because false information is so good at inflaming our passions, often making us angry, drawing us in to object or to argue, particularly when we're in online spaces. Next slide. Now, thanks to something I mentioned earlier called the illusory truth effect that I cover in my book, the more that we're exposed to fake news or false information, the easier it is to believe that it's either true or at least that it might be true, which is half the battle if you're trying to get people to believe things that aren't true, including lies or propaganda. Next slide. And speaking of battles, suffice it to say that Alex Jones, who I showed earlier, or Jesse Waters, as those folks have told us, there is indeed a war over information. Jesse Waters earlier this year described it as it's like a grassroots guerrilla warfare. Someone says something on social media, Elon Musk retweets it, Joe Rogan podcasts it, Fox broadcasts it, and by the time it reaches everyone, millions of people have seen it. Next slide. And this information war is being waged within what I call the disinformation food chain, in which the apex predators create and distribute false information. That's transmitted down to the mesopredators who both absorb the misinformation as well as transmit it further or transmit their own misinformation further. And it all settles down to the bottom of the food chain where most of us live, the consumers that encountered the false information. Next slide. Looking ahead to the future, I would argue that it's likely that disinformation will gain a stronger foothold in capturing the attention of consumers, thanks to print subscription-based journalism being further replaced by social media sites that are increasingly making profit-based decisions to abandon fact-checking while financially incentivizing viral content. Next slide. And I mentioned AI briefly. I think with the rise of AI and particularly AI generated summaries replacing Google searches and AI chatbots telling us things when we ask it questions, I think the problem of belief in false information is going to grow. We rarely, when we look at AI generated summaries, research has shown that people usually stop there. They don't look at the actual Google hits anymore, much less going to track down the actual source material that claims are made upon which claims are made. Next slide. And so in the modern media environment, it's really the apex predators who will win this war and are currently winning the war on information, while it's the consumers, that is we as a society, that will be the losers. So it is that many have argued that we already now live in a post-truth world where everything is disputed, shared facts have been replaced by a tale of two alternate realities. Next slide. And everyone thinks that they're the ones that have it right, and false beliefs are determining the fate of the world. Next slide. Okay, so far I've argued that mistrust explains why people discount reliable information. Misinformation then explains where we find counter narratives or where they find us. What's left to explain is what's driving mistrust and why some people believe misinformation and others don't, and why both sides of any debate tend to stick to their guns and refuse to budge. And so to understand that, we need to invoke the third M of my model, which is motivated reasoning. Next slide. So our modern vulnerability to misinformation must now be understood not only as a cognitive process, that is a byproduct of brains, but it must be understood as an interaction between our brains and the architecture of the media landscape that I just described, including the internet. And so confirmation bias is this term that means that all of us, we tend to gravitate towards information that supports what we already believe or want to believe, and we swipe past or ignore information that contradicts it. Next slide. This cartoon is the best illustration of confirmation bias I've ever seen. So, in the first panel, the guy's sitting at his computer. He says, I've heard the rhetoric from both sides. Time to do my own research on the real truth. He gets online to a search engine and he clicks on literally the first thing that agrees with what I already believe. And then he says, jackpot, right? So, on the internet, confirmation bias interacts with digital forces like echo chambers and filter bubbles that are designed to show us what we want to see. So, we're already primed to seek information that reinforces our beliefs, and the internet algorithms are also primed to give us that information and steer us towards it. And so I call this phenomenon, next slide, um, one more. I call this phenomenon confirmation bias on steroids. Next slide. Now, I was going to talk about motivated reasoning. So, motivated reasoning goes hand in hand with confirmation bias. Confirmation bias really refers to what we do when we encounter information, either choosing to engage with it or not, based on whether or not on the surface it seems to reinforce our beliefs. Motivated reasoning takes that process one step further and describes what happens when we do actually engage with information or appraise it, which is similar to confirmation bias, typically to judge information as very high quality when it supports what we already believe, um, or to judge the information as very poor quality if it refutes what we believe. And motivated reasoning often also specifically refers to our beliefs based on our ideological affiliations. That is, our social groups and networks where we have shared beliefs. And so it's really motivated reasoning that explains why political conservatives thinks that Fox News is great, but CNN is terrible and is fake news, or vice versa, why liberals think that CNN is great and Fox News is terrible. It also explains why some people, many of us, can hold such strong beliefs based on very flimsy evidence or even a lone dissenting opinion despite broader consensus. Next slide. And so this rationalization of motivated reasoning serves to reduce the unpleasantness of cognitive dissonance. Now, I also discuss cognitive dissonance in my book, but all it really means is the psychological tension that arises when our beliefs butt up against reality. And so one way to resolve that tension is simply to double down on belief. And by engaging in that kind of self deception, we never then have to admit that we're wrong. And because of that, this is sometimes referred to as identity protective cognition. The fact that we stick so tightly to our beliefs means that we can just be self assured that we're the ones who are right. Next slide. And so that then allows us to resolve that tension, to feel good about ourselves, and have this sort of sense of imperviousness to any challenges to our ideological worldviews. Next slide. All right, so that's basically the 3M model of false belief. Now, again, there's many, many different reasons why people believe things aren't true, but I think this is a helpful framework to understand what's going on these days in the world with regard to false belief, and when we think about other people who have other people or ourselves who have false beliefs, to think about it along these components. Next slide. Sorry, next slide, next slide, next slide. There we go. Um, so what I want to leave you with now is sort of a prelude to the last chapter of my book, which is to try to leave us with some thoughts about, if this is why we have false beliefs and have consequential false beliefs, what can we do about it? And, on different levels. And so the last chapter of my book is called A Prescription for a Post-Truth World, and it focuses on what we can do as individuals as well as a society to combat that three-headed monster: mistrust, misinformation, and motivated reasoning. It also spends some time talking about how we might better engage with our ideological opposites so that we can steer clear of this sort of endless confrontation and dispute. I encourage you to read more about it in the book, but I'll give you a brief synopsis here before I wrap up. So, next slide. So, to begin with, I think we really all have to look at the man in the mirror, or the woman, or whomever in the mirror, and resist the urge to think that this is a problem, that false belief is a problem only of the people that disagree with us. I think all too often that's what we tend to do. Now, look, sometimes that's correct, but certainly it's not universally correct. So I think it starts with looking at ourselves. Next slide. And so in the book, I advocate for something that I call the holy trinity of truth detection. Next slide. So this is made up of three components. The first is intellectual humility, which simply means accepting that we could be wrong, not falling into this trap of clinging to our beliefs and falling into the trap of confirmation bias and motivated reasoning so that we can just think that we're right about everything. So being intellectually more humble. Next slide. The next component is cognitive flexibility, right? This is what I said before about sort of the scientific perspective. It means accepting that we might be wrong, accepting that other people who disagree with us might be right, and having a genuine willingness to change our minds in the setting of exposure to new evidence. And finally, number three, the third component is analytical thinking, which people often use synonymously with critical thinking. And I feel like this always makes people think that it means being smart or, being able to do calculus or something like that. That's not what this means. Analytical thinking really just means slowing down and considering that when we encounter information in the world, it might be wrong. And to be especially wary about information that reinforces our beliefs. And instead of just clicking on it or sharing it or liking it or what have you, or reading the headline and saying, hey, I read this article that says such and such. No, like slow down, read the actual article, look at the article and see, what are they referring to, and then maybe look at the source material to see if the information that's being presented is actually accurate. I feel like this is such an important point these days. I'm still on social media. Occasionally, I'm on places like Facebook, and I'm constantly inundated with, videos. What do they call them? They're reels or something like that. And it seems like almost half of them these days are just AI fabricated things. They're not real people. They're not real quotations by human beings. They're people who are, being made to look like they're saying something, even though that didn't really happen. There's just so much that we see out there that's not real, and I think we have to be very skeptical about that. Next slide. Next, we can think about what can we do not just at the level of the individual, but at the level of society. Next slide. So if we go back to my 3M model, it's mistrust, misinformation, and motivated reasoning. What can we do to what can institutions of informational or epistemic authority do to gain or regain the trust of people? And you have to do that by earning trust, by engagement, collaboration, transparency. I think that's very important. Next slide. I also make an argument in the book to consider really overhauling education across the lifespan by teaching people not only like how to do a scientific experiment, but the philosophy of science. Why is science, why is the scientific method a good way to get us closer to truth? I think education ought to treat analytical thinking. It ought to treat media. It ought to teach media literacy. One of the most evidence-based techniques to combat false information or misinformation are also what we call inoculation or pre-bunking techniques. That means telling people about misinformation that's out there in the world rather than waiting till they've already encountered it and then trying to convince them otherwise. So reliable sources of information need to do a better job of pre-bunking, not just reacting to misinformation in the traditional way, which we call debunking. And finally, number three, what we can do as a society is we can really tackle on a societal level how we can reduce misinformation, whether that's through content moderation, but also given that we do live in a kind of free market of information, although in the book I refer to this as the flea market of information, because it's really about promoting the loudest, most raucous voices rather than there being a true free market. So I think within that market, we have to think about how we can do a better job of marketing the truth, making it less boring, making it more appealing, and also holding those liable for disseminating disinformation that causes harm, potentially liable for those harms. Next slide. Now that might seem like a pretty tall order, easier said than done, and you would be right about that, but it's certainly not impossible. And we need only look at Finland that has really tackled this head on over the past decade as a country. led by the president, saying like this is something important. We need to teach this across the lifespan, and they've had very good luck doing that. So I think if there's sufficient political and public will, this is possible, despite it seeming like it might be difficult. Next slide. All right, so I want to make sure we have some time for Q&A, but in conclusion, I'll say a couple words to answer one of the most frequent questions I get on the topic of false beliefs, which is how does one handle conversations with people who have gone down the rabbit hole of whether it's conspiracy theories or other types of false beliefs, pseudoscience, politics, what have you. And this question, of course, is always particularly relevant as we approach Thanksgiving, because everyone always wants to know, how do I deal with the proverbial Uncle Freddy? So next slide. So a few tips on next slide. There we back one, sorry. There we go. So a few tips on dealing with Uncle Freddy. Number one, be a North Star, right? People are when we talk about Uncle Freddy, we're talking about this person who like we actually care about and love. It's just that the relationship with them has been become so difficult because of their particular belief. So I think in as much as we want to maintain that relationship, we want to be there for someone. We want to be a North Star, right? A constant person who's not just cutting off ties. Okay, so that's number one, is to try to be supportive. Next, we have to listen. We have to seek compassionate understanding and be prepared to change our minds, right? That's, again, cognitive flexibility. So when people say, well, what do I do about my relative? My first response is, well, what's your goal? Right? The goal can't be to change that person's mind. The goal first has to be, I'm going to first do a better job of understanding where they're coming from. Now, that might involve setting appropriate boundaries or limits for engagement because it's actually right? Maybe Thanksgiving dinner isn't the best place to do this. So maybe we have to set a limit and say, look, we're not going to talk about this evening, but hey, let's meet up later, or let's talk about this at a later time. But today, maybe let's talk about the Warriors, or whoever. So I think that we can set appropriate boundaries around those conversations. I think it's really crucial, as you can see within my 3M model, that we have to understand different sources of information. If somebody says, oh, I believe that climate change is a hoax, or if you believe otherwise, then there should be a discussion about, like, why do you think that? And where have you heard that? And what evidence is there? So you can understand where they're coming from. And, as someone who's a psychiatrist and does psychotherapy, before we can ever try to change people's beliefs or challenge beliefs, we have to establish rapport. So that is a process before we can then start to say, hey, I heard something else, or I wonder if your source is correct. Like, you can't just jump in there and do that. That's just a good way to get into an argument. Okay, so there's a little bit more about that sort of approach in the book, but that's a rough guideline. Next slide. And so, I'm not going to promise that those tips are going to give you a Norman Rockwell Thanksgiving, but hopefully it will give you some good guideposts to follow when you're trying to engage with people that you disagree with, but who you also happen to care about. And I would mention at this juncture also that I would try to avoid having those conversations online, on social media, or even by text messages. I'm a big fan of face-to-face conversations. Next slide. And so I'm going to basically wrap up there and leave some space to answer questions. I do want to say that there's a lot in the book that I haven't covered here. And if you're interested in this topic, I certainly encourage you to take a deeper dive. Next slide. Um, and just a little bit of self-promotion here. Of course, San Francisco Public Library does have my book, so you can always check it out there without costing you a cent. But I must say that I was just on Amazon last night and I saw that Amazon is selling my book for only $3.66. So, which is less than it would cost for me to ship you a copy for free. So you might want to take a look at Amazon. If you do end up reading my book, I'd certainly appreciate you writing a review, whether you hate it or love it, to help get the word out. So thanks so much, and happy to answer questions now.
Hey, uh, Thank you so much, Dr. Pierre. We have one question from the audience in the Q&A. I'll read out the question. What about misinformation in psychiatry? I have been overdosed by a psychiatrist, and my first unborn child was poisoned by lithium in 1987, which was known to be teratogenic, toxic to unborn. How can physicians protect patients from big pharma whose claims are not independently verified by FDA?
Well, I mean, first, I would acknowledge that misinformation is present in all disciplines, whether it's psychiatry or medicine or in any industry. So I think the question comes from a good place that we should always think about how we can do a better job of combating misinformation. Let's see, how can physicians protect patients from big pharma whose claims are not independently verified? I don't exactly know what that means in terms of the independent verification, but again, I'm a big fan. I mean, what I do as a physician and what I do when I interact with patients is I read the research. And I don't look at drug company ads. I don't, look to news articles to find out what I should believe or not believe about medical treatment. I don't ask chatbots. I don't use AI. I look at the research and I read the across, if I'm trying to answer a question about the best treatment for a patient, I read a number of different studies and I try to synthesize that so I can give uh, my patients my best take on the existing research that's out there. And of course, we all have access to the information, so I think we can all do that. So that's my best answer, and I certainly support that conflicts of interest should be known. And ever since the Sunshine Act has been around, which I think at least 2 decades at this point, you can go online and you can find out whether or not physicians, for example, are getting money from big pharma, right? That's public information now. Okay,
Okay.
next question. What makes a person more or less susceptible to false beliefs? So yeah, good question. And again, I think that I showed the one slide of all the different cognitive variables. So there may be individuals who have particularly strong confirmation bias, more than another person. Or, I talked about this thing called bullshit receptivity, which you can read about in the book. It might be that some people are more susceptible to what psychologists call bullshit. Like this is actually a legitimate term that I define in the book. So there's certainly individual vulnerabilities. But again, what I would want to, and the reason I talk about the 3M model is because we all have these vulnerabilities. And I think that the main thing that explains our vulnerability has to do with those three components: mistrust, misinformation, and motivated reasoning. It's our trust or lack of trust in informational sources, it's our exposure to the misinformation that's out there in the world, and it's our ideological affiliations that make us want to believe one narrative strongly compared to some counter narrative. Let's see. I'm concerned that those trying to show light on areas of media information or bias are not invited to platforms to get their information out. How can we improve that? I'm not really sure specifically what that means. Invited to platforms. I mean, I think the difficult thing, when I talk about the flea market of disinformation or the flea market of information, rather, or the flea market of opinion, is that almost everyone has a platform, right? People have their TikTok things or their Twitter pages or their X pages or their Facebook pages. Like, to me, the platforming doesn't seem to be the problem. In fact, I almost feel like there's too much platforming, and that's sort of the problem that we're in now. So I think, as I said at the end of this talk, I think the solution has more to do with being better consumers of information. I think that part of the problem is there's so many different claims that are out there that everyone has a platform. So again, it's a media environment now where, if I happen to believe that lizard people have infiltrated the government or the earth is flat, I can say, well, I saw it on this YouTube video or this person said it, therefore it must be true. So I think to me, the problem isn't so much platforming. I almost feel like there's too much platforming and we need to um, figure out how to navigate that environment better to make us better consumers. In your clinical practice, have you seen gender or generational differences in susceptibility to false beliefs? That's a great question. I think it really depends on what kind of belief that we're talking about. I mean, we know from research that some of the vulnerability to false belief is actually greater in older people. I think in part because they weren't sort of raised in the era of the internet. And so they tend not to be as skeptical about it. I mean, we know, for example, that there are people who specifically target older people through email, through spam and this kind of thing to get them to give their money or, give away their fortune, that kind of thing. So we know that there are vulnerabilities across the lifespan, and yet some of those do occur, with younger people. So I wouldn't say that it's always one gender or always one generation or what age. I think it depends on what we're talking about. Certainly TikTok is a younger person's um, uh, is a form of media that younger people rely on, and so things that happen on TikTok that are misinformation then tend to affect younger people more. So I think it just depends on the topic and the medium. Okay, let's see. In regards to expertise, when would a mental health professional consider an alternative to solution to someone who may present delusional, but also may be a demonic experience, or even workplace mobbing or street acting harassment? How can a person who's confused navigate that confusion with professionals and different expertise before written off or committed to a mental illness? Okay. Well, I mean, ideally, if you're talking about a mental health professional, it's finding the right professional who, to a certain extent, follows the guidelines that I recommended for Uncle Freddie, right? It involves listening, compassionately, trying to understand what the person's experience is. Certainly, sometimes when you're working with patients, it helps to talk to other people that the patient's connected with, like their families or a spouse or somebody like that, to get a better sense of the situation. I've certainly encountered people who, there was a thought that they might have a delusion, and I've found out with some investigation that they're not delusional. That said, I've certainly found the reverse to be true at times as well. So I think it's the kind of the same attitude to look at situations with a blank slate, look at the evidence together, and then, sort of find out collaboratively where the truth lies. Let's see. What lessons should political scientists trying to understand misinformation from cognitive science? Well, I mean, those fields are actually working collaboratively these days. And so there are a lot of collaborations between political science and cognitive science and psychology. So I think there's actually quite a bit of cross-fertilization. And, my book is densely referenced, probably to a fault. There's hundreds of references in there, many of which link back to scientific papers, and there's certainly quite a bit that are authored by both political scientists and cognitive scientists together. So what specific lessons? I mean, there's many, many, many. I mean, to a certain extent, or psychology. Sorry, politics is psychological, but also psychology is politics. So I view them as less distinct. Um, Let's see, we're over time, but I'll squeeze in this last one. It looks to be about the FDA again. The research is often paid for by drug companies who have been known to misrepresent risk when applying to FDA for approval. How can our patients do due diligence if we cannot trust the pharmaceutical company claims, nor even the FDA, which seems to be unduly influenced by drug manufacturers and are unwilling to blah, 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 blah. Well, look, I mean, this is difficult because I think that a healthy society does need, when I use the term institution of authority, I'm talking about something like the FDA, right? So we need to make sure that the FDA is doing their job with regard to interacting with pharma and, approving medications or treatments or medical devices based on sound evidence. Um, so, what can we do as patients? I mean, I think we can demand that those institutions that are serving us are serving our best interests. Now, of course, the rub to everything I've said today is that again, our own personal perspectives tend to then color whether or not we think the FDA is doing a good job, right? There's been significant mistrust of the FDA over the past decade. And there are some people now who are thrilled that the FDA is now under RFK Jr. and that we're moving, away from vaccines, for example. I, on my own reading of the research, think that that is a dangerous direction. And that's sort of at the crux of my book, that this is why we disagree on things because of this trust issue. Some people think, well, the FDA is doing a great job. Other people say, no, they're doing a terrible job. They're in bed with pharma, and therefore, I shouldn't believe anything that they say. So making those kind of judgments is difficult, and it's often, again, based on our ideological groups. So I think we have to be wary about that. It's a good question, but it would be sort of a complicated answer that I would need more time to address. So looks like we're out of questions and out of time. So I definitely appreciate all of you for coming out to listen to me, and thanks so much.
With that, I want to thank Dr. Joe Pierre for sharing his insights on how misinformation and motivated reasoning influence our beliefs and how we can respond with both critical thinking and compassion. To the audience, I want to thank all of you for your curiosity and engagement. I encourage you to check out Dr. Pierre's book or get his book from the market. Um, and let's take today's lesson into our conversations and communities. And as a reminder, I'll be sending out a brief evaluation survey along with the link to today's recording. Your feedback is very important to us, so please take a moment to share your thoughts, and it will help us make future programs even better. Thank you once again, everyone, and wishing you all a wonderful rest of your day. Bye bye now.
All right. Thank you all.